Audrey Mitchell tapped her fingers nervously on the marble tabletop, checking her watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes. The upscale restaurant in downtown Boston buzzed with evening activity, waiters gliding between tables, the soft clink of silverware against fine china, murmured conversations punctuated by occasional laughter. 30 minutes late. Her blind date was 30 minutes late, and her patience was wearing dangerously thin. "Would you care for another glass of Chardonnay while you wait, ma'am?" the waiter asked, his expression a careful blend of sympathy and professionalism. "No, thank you. I think I'll be leaving soon," Audrey replied, reaching for her purse. At 36, she was done waiting for men who couldn't value her time. Her best friend Melissa's insistence that this guy was different had persuaded her to try one last blind date, but clearly it was the same old story. As Audrey slipped into her coat, a commotion at the restaurant entrance caught her attention. A tall man with broad shoulders hurried in, speaking apologetically to the hostess. Even from a distance, she could tell he was handsome, dark hair, slightly disheveled, sharp jawline, and dressed in a well-tailored navy suit that suggested money without flaunting it. When the hostess pointed in her direction, Audrey felt a flicker of curiosity despite her annoyance. "Audrey? I'm Garrett." "Garrett West," he said, slightly out of breath as he reached her table. "I cannot apologize enough for being late. There was an emergency with my daughter, and I—" "Your daughter?" Audrey interrupted, her eyebrows rising. Melissa had failed to mention children. "Yes, my 7-year-old Violet," Garrett replied, his expression softening at the mention of her name. "She's with her nanny now, but she had a bit of a meltdown when I was leaving." He hesitated. "I understand if you want to reschedule or cancel altogether." Something in his genuinely apologetic tone made Audrey reconsider. Unlike the excuses she'd heard countless times before, his seemed sincere. "I'm still here, aren't I?" she said, sitting back down and removing her coat. "But you should know I have a strict one-strike policy on lateness," Garrett smiled, a warm, relieved smile that reached his eyes. "Noted for all future reference. Thank you for giving me a chance." As the evening progressed, Audrey found herself unexpectedly enjoying Garrett's company. He was articulate, thoughtful, and listened more than he spoke, a rare quality in the men she usually dated. He asked about her work as an architectural restoration specialist with genuine interest, and when she mentioned her passion project of saving historical buildings in disadvantaged neighborhoods, his eyes lit up. "That's remarkable work," he said. "I've always believed preservation of history shouldn't just be for wealthy districts." "Most developers don't share that sentiment," Audrey replied, studying his reaction. "I'm not most developers," Garrett said with a slight smile, taking a sip of his bourbon. "You're in real estate?" she asked, suddenly wary. Her last relationship had ended badly with a developer who saw historical buildings as obstacles rather than treasures. "Investment primarily, but yes, West Holdings has a substantial real estate division," he admitted, "though we specialize more in creating mixed-income housing than luxury condos." The waiter approached with their main courses, momentarily pausing their conversation. When he left, Audrey leaned forward slightly. "West Holdings," she repeated slowly. "As in the West Building downtown? The one with the controversy over the historical facade?" Garrett's expression changed subtly. "Yes, but that situation was resolved by bulldozing a landmark," Audrey finished, placing her napkin beside her plate. The evening had been going too well. She should have known there would be a catch. "Actually, no," Garrett countered calmly. "If you're thinking of the Madison Street project from 3 years ago, we preserved the facade and integrated it into the new structure. It cost us an additional $4 million, but it was the right thing to do." Audrey paused, her water glass halfway to her lips. "That was you, the anonymous donor who funded the preservation efforts?" A slight flush colored Garrett's cheeks. "I prefer to keep business and philanthropy separate when possible." The revelation shifted something in Audrey's perception. She'd followed that project closely, amazed when an unknown benefactor had stepped in to save the historical elements that made the building special. Their conversation flowed more easily after that, touching on everything from their favorite authors to childhood memories. Garrett spoke of raising Violet as a single father after his wife left when their daughter was just 2. She couldn't handle the pressure of being married to someone with family money, he explained without bitterness. "My parents built West Holdings from nothing, but by the time they passed away and left it to me, it had become significant." "Some people find that intimidating. Is that why Melissa didn't tell me exactly who you were?" Audrey asked, beginning to understand. Garrett nodded. I asked her not to. I wanted whoever I met to see me, not my bank account or last name. As they shared dessert, a dark chocolate souffle that Audrey normally would have refused but couldn't resist, Garrett's phone buzzed several times in succession. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing at it. "It's my home number." "Would you mind if I—" "Of course not," Audrey insisted. "Please check on your daughter." Garrett stepped away briefly, returning with a concerned expression. "The nanny says Violet is having trouble sleeping. She's asking for me." He looked genuinely torn. "I hate to cut this short, but go," Audrey said immediately. "Your daughter needs you." "I'd like to see you again," Garrett said, reaching for the check, "if you're willing." Audrey hesitated. Despite their connection, she wasn't sure about getting involved with a single father, especially one with his wealth and position. Her last relationship had taught her that different worlds often stayed different, regardless of initial attraction. "I'll think about it," she said honestly. "You have my number." Garrett nodded, respecting her response without pushing. As they walked together toward the exit, he asked, "May I at least call you a car?" "I'm perfectly capable of finding my own transportation," Audrey replied with a small smile. "But thank you." They paused at the restaurant entrance, the moment suspended between them. Then Garrett leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. "I hope I hear from you, Audrey Mitchell," he said softly before stepping outside to the waiting black SUV. Watching him leave, Audrey found herself both drawn to him and wary of the complications his life would bring to hers. She hadn't expected to enjoy the evening as much as she had, and that unsettled her carefully ordered world. What Audrey couldn't possibly know was that across town a sleepless little girl was about to change the course of her carefully planned life in ways she could never have imagined. 3 days passed with no word from Garrett. Audrey told herself it was for the best. She had projects that needed her attention, and complicated entanglements with wealthy single fathers weren't part of her 5-year plan. Still, she found herself checking her phone more often than usual, a fact that Melissa was quick to notice when they met for their weekly coffee. "So, how was the date with Garrett?" Melissa asked, stirring honey into her tea at their favorite cafe near Boston Common. "And don't even try to be vague. I want details." "It was fine," Audrey replied, attempting nonchalance. "You could have mentioned he was Garrett West of West Holdings, by the way." Melissa shrugged. "Would you have gone if I had?" "Probably not," Audrey admitted. "You know how I feel about getting involved with clients or potential clients." "Exactly why I kept that detail to myself," Melissa said smugly. "So, are you seeing him again?" Audrey sipped her latte. "He hasn't called." "But you want him to," Melissa observed, reading her friend's expression. "You know, sometimes you're allowed to call first. It's the 21st century." "It's not about gender roles," Audrey protested. "It's about compatibility. His world and mine don't exactly align." "Oh, please," Melissa rolled her eyes. "You restore historical buildings for wealthy clients. You attended private schools. Your parents might not be billionaires, but they're hardly struggling. The only world that doesn't align is the one you've created in your head, where you're some kind of working-class hero." Audrey winced at her friend's bluntness. "It's not about money. It's about values. And you determined his values in one dinner," Melissa challenged. Before Audrey could respond, her phone rang, an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Is this Audrey Mitchell?" A woman's voice, crisp and professional. "Yes, speaking. This is Patricia Winters, Violet West's nanny. Mr. West asked me to call you regarding a rather unusual situation." Audrey's heart quickened. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, but Miss Violet is quite insistent about speaking with you. She's become fixated on the idea after overhearing her father mention your name. Normally, Mr. West wouldn't impose, but Violet can be determined." "I see," Audrey said, though she didn't see at all. "And Mr. West couldn't call himself because—" There was a slight hesitation on the other end. "He's currently in an emergency board meeting. Corporate crisis of some sort. He sends his apologies for not calling personally." The woman lowered her voice. "Between us, he's been meaning to call you, but this week has been chaotic. Some issue with investors threatening to pull out." Audrey glanced at Melissa, who was watching her with undisguised interest. "When would Violet like to speak with me?" "Actually, we're at Heartstrings Cafe on Newbury Street right now. It's only a few blocks from Boston Common. If you're free, Violet would be thrilled to meet you for hot chocolate." The request was so unexpected that Audrey found herself agreeing before she could think better of it. After hanging up, she explained the bizarre situation to Melissa. "His daughter wants to meet me. Apparently she overheard him talking about our date. That's adorable, Melissa grinned. And a perfect excuse to see him again. The nanny said he's not there. He's in meetings. Even better. You get to know his kid without the pressure of him being there. Go, this is fate. 30 minutes later, Audrey found herself approaching Heartstrings Cafe, a charming establishment known for its elaborate hot chocolate creations and homemade pastries. Through the window, she could see a small girl with dark curls sitting across from an elegant older woman. The child was gesturing animatedly, her face bright with excitement. As Audrey pushed open the door, uncertainty washing over her, the little girl's head turned. For a moment they simply looked at each other, Audrey standing awkwardly by the entrance, Violet staring with wide, intelligent eyes that were startlingly similar to her father's. Then, in a heartbeat, everything changed. Violet's face transformed with a look of pure astonishment. She stood up on her chair, pointing directly at Audrey, and exclaimed loud enough for the entire cafe to hear, "You're from Daddy's story. You're the princess who saves old castles." The nanny, Patricia, Audrey presumed, quickly pulled Violet down from the chair, murmuring something about inside voices. But the damage, or perhaps the magic, was already done. A few patrons smiled indulgently, while others looked curiously between Audrey and the enthusiastic child. "I'm so sorry," Patricia said as Audrey approached their table. "Violet, remember what we discussed about appropriate greetings?" But Violet was practically vibrating with excitement. "But she is, Patricia. Look at her. She has the sunset hair and everything, just like Daddy described." Audrey self-consciously touched her copper-colored hair, taken aback by the child's reaction. "Hello, Violet," she said, sliding into the empty chair. "It's nice to meet you. I'm Audrey." "I know," Violet said emphatically. "You're the lady who makes broken things beautiful again. Daddy tells me your story every night." "My story?" Audrey asked, bewildered. She accepted the menu Patricia handed her with a polite nod, but kept her attention on the animated child across the table. "The bedtime story," Violet explained, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, about the princess who saves the forgotten castles that everyone else wants to knock down. "She has hair like fire and eyes that see the beauty in old things." The little girl leaned forward, lowering her voice to a dramatic whisper. "Daddy says you're not really a princess, but you're even better, because you're real." Heat crept up Audrey's neck. The idea that Garrett had been telling his daughter stories inspired by her, stories that clearly painted her in an admirable light, was both flattering and unsettling. How much had he learned about her before their date? "Violet," Patricia interjected gently, "why don't you tell Ms. Mitchell about your school project while I order our hot chocolates?" As Patricia excused herself to the counter, Violet launched into a detailed explanation of her second-grade historical buildings project. "We had to pick a building in Boston that's important and make a model. Most kids picked boring ones like the State House, but I picked the Emerson Textile Factory because Daddy said you helped save it." Audrey's surprise deepened. The Emerson project had been one of her first major restoration successes 3 years ago, a crumbling former textile mill that developers had wanted to demolish. After months of community organizing and grant writing, she'd secured funding to transform it into affordable housing that preserved its historical elements. "How did your father know about that project?" Audrey asked, increasingly puzzled by how much Garrett seemed to know about her professional life. Violet shrugged, stirring her hot chocolate as Patricia returned with drinks for everyone. "Daddy knows everything. He has pictures of all the buildings you fixed in his office." Patricia shot Audrey an apologetic look. "I should explain," she said quietly, while Violet became momentarily distracted by arranging the marshmallows in her drink. "Mr. West has admired your preservation work for some time. The West Foundation has anonymously funded several of your community projects." "What?" Audrey nearly spilled her hot chocolate. "The grant money for the East Side restoration came from him, among others." Patricia nodded. "He's followed your career quite closely. When his friend mentioned setting him up with an Audrey Mitchell, he was quite taken with the coincidence. He didn't realize until your date that you were the same person." "So he knew who I was all along," Audrey said, a complicated mix of emotions washing over her. Was their entire date just research for him? Some kind of elaborate verification process for his foundation's investments? "Oh, no," Patricia corrected quickly. "He had no idea until you mentioned your work with historical buildings in disadvantaged neighborhoods. That's when he realized. He was quite stunned, actually." Before Audrey could process this information, Violet tugged at her sleeve. "Can you come see my project? I brought it." She pointed to a large paper bag beside the table. "Patricia said we shouldn't bother you with it, but since you're here—" Unable to resist the child's enthusiasm, Audrey agreed. Violet carefully extracted a remarkably detailed model of the Emerson textile factory from the bag, complete with tiny red bricks made from painted clay and miniature windows fashioned from transparency film. "This is incredible," Audrey said truthfully, examining the model. "Did you make this yourself?" "Daddy helped with the cutting parts, but I did all the designing and painting," Violet said proudly. "My teacher said it was museum quality. I got a gold star and everything." "You certainly deserved it," Audrey replied, genuinely impressed by the child's skill and attention to detail. As they discussed the model, Audrey found herself charmed by Violet's intelligence and obvious passion for architecture, a passion clearly nurtured by her father. The child spoke about cornices and flying buttresses with the vocabulary of someone much older, yet maintained the excitement and wonder of her 7 years. "Daddy says buildings are like people," Violet explained seriously. "They have stories inside their walls, and it's mean to tear them down just because they're old or not fancy anymore." "Your dad sounds like a wise man," Audrey said, increasingly confused by the disconnect between the Garrett West she'd met, who seemed genuine and thoughtful, and the wealthy developer she'd assumed him to be. "He is," Violet agreed solemnly. "But he's sad sometimes, especially since Grandma and Grandpa went to heaven. He works a lot, and Patricia says he forgets to have fun." Patricia cleared her throat. "Violet, remember our conversation about private family matters?" The child sighed dramatically. "Sorry, but it's not private if it's true, is it?" Audrey suppressed a smile at the child's logic. "Everyone needs to remember to have fun sometimes," she offered diplomatically. "That's what I said," Violet exclaimed. "That's why I told him he should ask you on a date, because in his stories, the princess always makes him smile." Audrey nearly choked on her hot chocolate. "You told him to ask me out?" Violet nodded vigorously. "I saw your picture in the magazine about the old theater you fixed. I told Daddy, that's her, that's the princess from your stories. And then Uncle Ryan, he's not really my uncle, but he's Daddy's best friend. He said he knew someone named Melissa, who knew you." She beamed proudly. "So it was mostly my idea." The realization that her blind date had been orchestrated by a 7-year-old left Audrey momentarily speechless. She glanced at Patricia, who nodded confirmation. "Miss Violet can be quite persuasive when she sets her mind to something," the nanny said with obvious affection. "Does your father know you're here with me now?" Audrey asked, suddenly wondering if Garrett was aware of this meeting. A guilty look flashed across Violet's face. "Not exactly. I told Patricia I wouldn't sleep until I met you, and she said that was emotional blackmail, but then she called you anyway." She looked up with wide, innocent eyes. "Are you mad?" "No, I'm not mad," Audrey assured her. "But I think your dad might be worried if he doesn't know where you are." "Oh, he knows we're at Heartstrings," Patricia interjected. "He just doesn't know you're joining us. I thought it might be easier this way without any adult complications." The phrase adult complications hung in the air, and Audrey found herself wondering exactly what Patricia knew about her hesitation regarding Garrett. Before she could inquire further, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made the sender immediately clear. "Audrey, this is Garrett West. I've just learned that my daughter and her nanny have ambushed you at a cafe. I'm deeply sorry for any awkwardness. I'm heading there now, but please don't feel obligated to wait. Again, my sincere apologies." As Audrey stared at her phone, processing this development, Violet peered over at the screen. "Is that Daddy? Is he coming here?" Her face brightened momentarily before falling. "Is he mad?" "I think he's just concerned," Audrey said carefully, noting the child's quick shift to worry. It spoke volumes about the relationship between father and daughter. Violet clearly valued her father's approval. "He's never really mad at me," Violet said, fidgeting with her napkin. "But sometimes he gets his serious voice when I do impulsive things. Dr. Hendricks says I need to work on my impulse control." "Dr. Hendricks?" "My talking doctor," Violet explained. "I see her every Tuesday because sometimes my brain goes too fast and I need help slowing down my thoughts." She tapped her temple. "I have ADHD. That means my brain works differently than some people's." The candid way Violet discussed her diagnosis without shame or hesitation was refreshing. It was clear Garrett had created an environment where his daughter's neurodiversity was treated as matter of fact rather than something to hide. "Well," Audrey said, smiling at the child, "some of the most brilliant people I know have brains that work differently, and from what I can see, your brain comes up with some pretty amazing ideas." Violet beamed at this, but her response was cut short by the cafe door opening. Garrett West stood in the entrance, slightly out of breath, his expression cycling rapidly from concern to relief to embarrassment as he spotted their table. "Oh boy," Violet whispered. "That's definitely his serious face." Garrett approached their table with measured steps, his expression softening as he drew closer. He was dressed more casually than at their dinner, dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that somehow made him look both more approachable and more handsome. "Audrey," he said, her name carrying a mixture of apology and warmth. "I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am about this ambush." "Daddy, don't be mad," Violet interjected quickly. "I just wanted to meet the princess from your stories." "And look," she gestured to Audrey with dramatic flair. "She's even prettier than you described." Garrett's cheeks flushed with color. "Violet, we've discussed boundaries and privacy," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Ms. Mitchell has her own life and responsibilities. We can't just insert ourselves into it without invitation." "But she said she wasn't mad," Violet countered, looking to Audrey for confirmation. "Right?" Audrey found herself smiling despite the awkwardness. "I'm not mad at all. In fact, I've enjoyed meeting Boston's youngest architectural preservationist." She nodded toward the model still displayed on the table. "Violet showed me her school project. It's quite impressive." Relief washed over Garrett's face. "Thank you for being understanding." He turned to Patricia. "Would you mind taking Violet to pick out a pastry? I'd like a moment to speak with Miss Mitchell." Once they were alone, Garrett sat in the chair Patricia had vacated. "I was in the middle of a crisis meeting when Patricia texted that she'd arranged this meeting. I came as soon as I could extract myself." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Audrey was beginning to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "I had no idea Violet was so determined to meet you. Your daughter mentioned that I feature in her bedtime stories," Audrey said, watching his reaction carefully. Garrett's embarrassment deepened. "I can explain that. After our date, Violet was full of questions about where I'd been. I told her I'd met someone who restores old buildings, something she's become interested in after visiting some of my work sites. One thing led to another, and it evolved into this narrative about a preservationist who saves historical structures. 'The princess who saves forgotten castles,'" Audrey quoted, fighting a smile. "Not exactly how I phrased it," Garrett winced, "but Violet has a flair for the dramatic. The stories were just a way to encourage her interest in architecture and preservation. I never imagined she'd connect them to you so—" He searched for the word, "emphatically." Audrey traced the rim of her mug thoughtfully. "Patricia mentioned something else interesting. She said the West Foundation has funded some of my community projects." Garrett's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Yes. Your work aligns with our mission of sustainable urban development that respects historical context. The Foundation makes grants based on merit and impact potential, not personal connections. So all those anonymous donations to save buildings in underserved neighborhoods, that was you?" Audrey studied him with new eyes. "Why stay anonymous?" "My parents taught me that real philanthropy doesn't need recognition," he replied simply. "And in the development world, my family name comes with certain expectations. Sometimes it's easier to do good work quietly." The conversation paused as Violet returned, proudly carrying a chocolate croissant nearly the size of her face. "Look what Daddy said I could have." She settled back beside Audrey, seemingly oblivious to the tension between the adults. "A special treat for a special occasion," Garrett explained, his eyes meeting Audrey's briefly. There was something unspoken in his gaze, a question perhaps, or an apology. As Violet happily demolished her pastry, conversation shifted to safer topics. Garrett asked about Audrey's current projects, and she found herself describing her work on a former public library in a neglected neighborhood. "The foundation is failing, and water damage has destroyed much of the interior woodwork, but the community is determined to save it," she explained. "We're struggling to secure the final funding before the city condemns it next month." "That wouldn't happen to be the Blackwell Library on Harding Street, would it?" Garrett asked, his interest clearly piqued. "Yes, actually. How did you know?" "I've had my eye on that building for some time," he admitted. "The architecture is remarkable. Those flying buttresses are unusual for a municipal building of that era." "Flying buttresses," Violet exclaimed, chocolate smeared across her cheek. "Like in my model." Garrett smiled fondly at his daughter before returning his attention to Audrey. "The West Foundation might be interested in supporting that project, not because of any personal connection," he added quickly, "but because it meets our criteria for historical significance and community impact." Audrey felt suddenly conflicted. The Blackwell project desperately needed funding, and Garrett's foundation could provide it. Yet accepting his help now seemed complicated in ways it wouldn't have been before their date, before meeting Violet. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want any special treatment because of this." She gestured vaguely between them. "Of course not," Garrett agreed. "The Foundation's board makes decisions independently. I merely bring worthy projects to their attention." Their conversation was interrupted by Patricia's discreet return. "I hate to disrupt, but we have that appointment at 4, Mr. West." Garrett checked his watch and nodded. "Violin lessons," he explained to Audrey. "We shouldn't be late." "I don't want to go yet," Violet protested, looking frantically between Audrey and her father. "Can't Audrey come watch my lesson or come to dinner or—" "Violet," Garrett said firmly, "Ms. Mitchell has her own plans and responsibilities." Seeing the child's crestfallen expression, Audrey impulsively said, "Actually, I don't have plans tonight." The words hung in the air between them. Garrett looked at her with surprise, while Violet's face transformed with delight. "You could come to our house," the child exclaimed. "We're having lasagna because Tuesdays are Italian night, and Mrs. Hoffman, she's our cook, makes the best garlic bread in the universe." Audrey looked to Garrett, suddenly uncertain. Had she overstepped? "We would be honored if you'd join us," he said after a moment, his voice warm, "but only if it's truly convenient for you." "Lasagna happens to be my favorite," Audrey replied, surprised by how much she meant it, "and I'd love to hear more about those flying buttresses." The genuine smile that spread across Garrett's face made something flutter in her chest. "Excellent. I can send a car for you at 7. Or you're welcome to drive yourself if that's more comfortable." "I'll drive," Audrey said, maintaining that small bit of independence. As they exchanged contact information and Garrett wrote down his address, Audrey found herself wondering what she was getting into. Her carefully ordered life didn't typically include spontaneous dinner invitations from billionaires and their precocious daughters. Yet something about Violet's earnestness and Garrett's quiet dignity had breached her usual defenses. She was curious now, not just about the man himself, but about the world he'd created for his daughter, a world that apparently included bedtime stories about a princess who looked remarkably like Audrey. Later that evening, as Audrey followed the GPS directions to Garrett's address, she was surprised when it led her not to one of Boston's Tony high-rises, but to a tree-lined street in Brookline. The house, when she finally located it, was certainly substantial. A beautifully restored Victorian with a wraparound porch, but not the ostentatious mansion she'd half expected. She'd just reached for the brass door knocker when the door flew open to reveal Violet, dressed in what appeared to be her finest party dress, complete with patent leather shoes and a slightly crooked bow in her hair. "You came?" the child exclaimed, grabbing Audrey's hand and pulling her inside. "I told Daddy you would, but he said not to get my hopes up because you might change your mind, but I knew you wouldn't, because princesses always keep their promises. Violet, please let Ms. Mitchell at least get through the door before your interrogation begins," came Garrett's amused voice from further inside. The home's interior was warm and inviting, hardwood floors covered with Persian rugs, walls painted in rich, earthy tones, and built-in bookshelves filled with an eclectic mix of leather-bound classics and colorful children's books. It was clearly the home of people who actually lived in their space rather than merely showcasing it. Garrett appeared in the hallway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Welcome," he said, his smile genuine. "Dinner's almost ready." "You cook?" Audrey couldn't hide her surprise. "Mrs. Hoffman had a family emergency," he explained, "so you're subject to my limited culinary skills tonight. I hope lasagna from a box is acceptable." Before Audrey could respond, Violet stage whispered, "Daddy burns water, but his box lasagna is actually pretty good." "I'm sure it will be delicious," Audrey assured them both, charmed by this glimpse into their domestic life. As Violet led her on a whirlwind tour of the house, "This is the thinking room where Daddy does his work, and this is the art room where I'm not allowed to paint on the walls anymore," Audrey began to see a different picture emerging of the man she'd met at that restaurant. Garrett West wasn't just a wealthy developer or anonymous philanthropist. He was a father who coached his daughter's soccer team despite his busy schedule, as evidenced by the team photo on the refrigerator. He was someone who valued education, shown by the extensive library and the multiplication tables prominently displayed in Violet's colorful bedroom. And he was a man who, despite his resources, chose to live in a home that prioritized comfort and family over ostentation. Dinner was a lively affair, with Violet dominating the conversation. She insisted on sitting between the adults, bouncing in her seat as she alternated between sharing detailed accounts of her school day and asking Audrey increasingly personal questions. "Do you have a prince at your castle?" Violet asked between bites of slightly overcooked lasagna. "Violet," Garrett admonished gently, "that's not an appropriate question." "But in the stories, the princess always has a prince," Violet persisted. "Or does Audrey have a princess instead? Jenny in my class has 2 mummies." Audrey couldn't help but laugh. "No prince or princess at my castle, just me and a very lazy cat named Darwin." "You have a cat?" Violet's eyes widened with delight. "Daddy's allergic, so we can't have cats. We have fish, but they're boring because you can't cuddle them." "Darwin isn't much for cuddling either," Audrey admitted. "He mostly sleeps in sunbeams and judges my life choices." Garrett smiled at this exchange, seeming content to let the conversation flow naturally. There was an ease about him in his home environment that hadn't been present at the restaurant, a quiet confidence that came from being in his element. After dinner, Violet insisted on showing Audrey her collection of architectural drawings. "I want to build places like you save," she explained, carefully laying out papers covered with colorful, surprisingly detailed renderings of buildings. "These are impressive," Audrey said truthfully, noting the child's natural eye for proportion and detail. "You have real talent, Violet." "Daddy says I get it from Grandma," the girl replied proudly. "She was an architect before she got sick." Garrett, who had been quietly clearing dishes, paused at this. "My mother designed several notable buildings in Boston before MS forced her to retire," he explained. "She's the reason I became interested in urban development, though I never had her artistic ability." "Violet clearly inherited it," Audrey observed, noting how the child beamed at the comparison to her grandmother. As the evening progressed, Garrett prepared hot chocolate, successfully despite Violet's dramatic warnings about his kitchen skills, and the 3 of them settled in the living room. Violet, clearly fighting sleep despite her excitement, curled up beside Audrey on the sofa. "Would you tell me a story?" the child asked, her eyelids growing heavy. "About a princess who saves buildings?" Audrey glanced at Garrett, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Well," she began hesitantly, "once there was a building that everyone had forgotten. It stood alone on a quiet street, its windows dark like closed eyes, its bricks crumbling like an old man's bones." She continued the improvised tale, weaving in elements from her actual restoration work on an abandoned theater, but simplifying the narrative for her young audience. By the time the fictional princess had convinced the town to save the forgotten building, transforming it into a community arts center where children could learn to dance and sing, Violet was fast asleep against her side. "You're a natural," Garrett said softly, carefully lifting his daughter into his arms. "Would you mind if I put her to bed? I'll be quick." When he returned several minutes later, he carried 2 glasses of wine. "I hope you don't mind. It seemed like a fitting end to an unexpected evening." Audrey accepted the glass, studying him over its rim. "You're not what I expected, Garrett West." "What did you expect?" he asked, settling into an armchair across from her. "Someone more," she searched for the right word, "corporate. Less hands-on as a father. Less normal." He laughed softly at this. "I think that's the first time a billionaire has been accused of being too normal." "Why didn't you tell me who you were at dinner?" she asked, the question that had been lingering since their date. "Would it have changed things if I had?" "Probably," Audrey admitted. "I have the preconceptions about wealthy developers. Exactly why I didn't mention it," he said simply. "I wanted you to see me, not my bank account or the assumptions that come with it." They fell into easy conversation then, discovering shared interests beyond architecture and preservation, a mutual love for historical mysteries, a shared appreciation for jazz, a similar dry sense of humor. As the evening stretched on, Audrey found herself increasingly drawn to this man who wore his wealth so lightly and his responsibilities so seriously. "Can I ask you something personal?" she ventured, after a comfortable lull in conversation. "Of course." "Why me?" "For the date, I mean." "You could presumably have your pick of companions." Garrett considered this, swirling the last of his wine thoughtfully. "I've dated since my divorce, not extensively, but enough to know what doesn't work. The women who were interested in Garrett West, CEO, weren't interested in Garrett West, father of a sometimes difficult 7-year-old. He smiled ruefully. "And I've reached a point in my life where I'm not willing to compartmentalize those aspects of myself. And your friend Melissa thought I'd be different?" "Ryan, Melissa's husband. mentioned you were passionate about your work, principled about your choices, and completely unimpressed by status. His eyes met hers. All qualities I admire. And the stories you told Violet about the princess who saves buildings? When did those start? A flush crept up his neck. About a year ago. I read an article about your work on the Emerson Project. Your passion for preservation resonated with me. It reminded me of my mother's approach to architecture. I mentioned you in passing to Violet, and she was fascinated by the idea of someone who saved buildings instead of tearing them down. The stories evolved from there. He looked slightly embarrassed. I never imagined she'd connect them so directly to you when we met. So you've been telling your daughter bedtime stories about me for a year, funded my projects anonymously, and then coincidentally agreed to a blind date. Audrey raised an eyebrow. That could seem a bit stalkerish from a certain perspective. Garrett winced. When you put it that way, it does sound concerning, but I promise you the connection between the preservationist in Violet's stories and you was abstract until recently. And the Foundation's funding decisions are made by a board, not just me. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. When Ryan mentioned setting me up with an Audrey who restored old buildings, I thought it might be the same person, but I wasn't certain until our conversation at dinner confirmed it. Something in his candor convinced her he was telling the truth. It's quite a coincidence. Or fate, he suggested with a slight smile, if you believe in such things. Their eyes met, and Audrey felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. She was attracted to him, his intelligence, his devotion to his daughter, his unexpected humility, but she was also wary of the complications his life would bring to hers. I should go, she said, placing her empty glass on the coffee table. It's getting late. Garrett walked her to the door, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Thank you for giving us a chance tonight, he said softly. Both of us. Violet is wonderful, Audrey replied truthfully. You're doing an amazing job with her. High praise from a princess, he said, with a smile that reached his eyes. Before she could overthink it, Audrey rose on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek. Good night, Garrett. 2 weeks later, Audrey stood in the dilapidated interior of the Blackwell Library, supervising as contractors assessed the structural damage to the roof. The building's condition had deteriorated further after recent heavy rains, and she was beginning to lose hope that they could save it before the city's deadline. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Garrett had been texting regularly since their dinner, and they'd shared lunch twice, once with Violet present, once without. Each interaction deepened her attraction to him, even as she maintained her cautious distance. But this message wasn't from Garrett. It was from her contact at the city planning office. Blackwell condemnation postponed indefinitely. Anonymous donor has guaranteed funding for complete restoration. Details to follow. As she stared at her phone in disbelief, a second message arrived, this one from Garrett. Not my doing. Foundation Board voted unanimously based on your proposal's merits. Congratulations. Dinner tonight to celebrate? V insists on making cupcakes in your honor. Audrey smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Perhaps there was room in her carefully ordered life for unexpected complications after all, especially complications that came in the form of a thoughtful man and his story-loving daughter. 6 months later, Audrey stood on the steps of the newly restored Blackwell Library, now transformed into a community center with art spaces, literacy programs, and affordable apartments on the upper floors. Beside her, Violet bounced excitedly in a flower girl dress, practicing scattering petals. Not yet, sweetheart, Audrey laughed, adjusting the child's circlet of daisies. Save the petals for the actual ceremony. But I've been practicing forever, Violet complained good-naturedly. And you look so pretty, like a real princess. Audrey smoothed the simple ivory dress she'd chosen for her wedding day, elegant but practical, like the woman herself. The princess who saves buildings, she mused, remembering how this unexpected journey had begun. And the king who saves princesses, came Garrett's voice as he climbed the steps to join them, handsome in his tailored suit. Breaking tradition by seeing his bride before the ceremony had been Violet's idea, she'd insisted they take family photos at the library, where the story really started. As they posed together on the steps of the building they'd saved together, Garrett with his funding connections, Audrey with her preservation expertise, she marveled at how differently her life had unfolded from her careful plans. "Any regrets about saying yes?" Garrett murmured, his arm warm around her waist. "Only that I almost walked out of that blind date," Audrey replied, leaning into his embrace. Thank goodness for persistent 7-year-olds. I'm 8 now, Violet corrected proudly, slipping between them, and I knew you were the real princess all along. As their small wedding party gathered and their chosen family surrounded them with love, Audrey reflected that perhaps the best preservation work wasn't just about saving buildings, but about recognizing the value in connections that seemed unlikely at first glance. Connections that, with care and attention, could be transformed into something beautiful and lasting. Her story hadn't ended with a conventional happily ever after. Instead, it had evolved into something richer, a shared commitment to building a future together, where a once lonely princess had found not only her place, but her family. A family bound not by obligation but by choice, understanding, and love.